September 3, 1944, 6:30 hours, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The sun had not yet crested over the pine-lined ridge when the gates opened. A train from New Jersey hissed to a halt on the private military siding, brakes shrieking in protest. Dozens of German prisoners shuffled down steel steps, boots scraping metal, eyes scanning a landscape none had ever imagined. Behind them were months of war, surrender, and transport under guard. Ahead, barbed wire, guard towers, marching orders, but no one expected comfort. No one expected softness. Least of all Corporal Ernst Vogel of the 21st Panzer Division, who stepped off the train half expecting a chain gang, a labor camp, or a tent city of humiliation. Instead, the first thing he smelled was sawdust. And beneath it, something strange. Rubber. The column of POWs was silent as U.S. MPs herded them toward processing. Some murmured, others squinted. But it was Vogel who stopped first, caught by a sound he couldn't place. A steady thud, then another, and another, rhythmic, controlled. Whomp, whomp, whomp. He froze, eyes narrowed. It wasn't gunfire, it wasn't hammering, it was deeper, softer, almost pulsing. His squadmate Fisher leaned in. "Do you hear that?" Then a new sound, screeching rubber, shouts, the bounce of something hollow and fast across hardwood. It was the sound of a basketball echoing off maple floors. The German POWs didn't know it yet, but they were about to walk into a part of America no one had prepared them for. A world not of brutality, but of structure, of routine, of strange generosity. And above all, they were about to see something none of them had ever imagined in wartime custody. A fully equipped gymnasium. The first time Vogel saw it was from the outside, a long wooden building with small windows and a wide double-door entrance guarded by two unarmed MPs. The Germans were herded past it en route to barracks, but the doors were open. Inside, a group of U.S. soldiers, not in formation, not shouting, were jogging around a polished floor. Another pair were punching bags suspended from thick beams. Others were lifting what looked like iron wheels stacked on bars. No one spoke, not in Vogel's column. They kept marching, but the idea had already seated itself in their minds. Why would the Americans build such a place for soldiers who were not in combat? Why waste space, materials, and manpower for sport? They assumed it was for the guards, until 2 days later. On the morning of September 5th, after roll call and a breakfast of eggs, white toast, and hot black coffee that seemed almost surreal, the camp warden issued an announcement. Selected prisoners on good behavior would begin a rotation in the physical activity program, gymnasium access included. The word spread like wildfire. Some dismissed it as a trap, others joked it was a test. A few believed it was a humiliation ritual, put the defeated Germans on display while Americans watched them struggle. But Vogel, ever the pragmatist, volunteered. "If it's a punishment," he told Fisher, "at least it's indoors." They reported to the gym at 1400 hours. Inside, the smell hit first: sweat, chalk leather, and varnished wood. The room was lit by skylights. An American NCO, a wiry, calm sergeant named Mallory, greeted them with a clipboard and a nod. "No yelling," he said. "No shoving, you break it, you fix it." Then he pointed. There were free weights, dumbbells in racks, squat racks with heavy iron plates, a full-size basketball court, jump ropes, a corner lined with heavy bags, speed bags, gloves neatly stacked on hooks. "Warm up," Mallory said, "then pick your station." Vogel stood in place, stunned. The floor beneath him was spotless, the windows open. The sun painted the room in gold and shadow. This was no trap. Fisher stepped up beside him. "They built this for us." "No," Vogel said slowly. "They built it for themselves, and now they let us use it." Word spread faster than any guard order. Within a week, dozens of POWs were rotating through the gym. Vogel took to the punching bag, gloves tight, form crude but improving. Fisher became obsessed with the iron weights. He deadlifted every morning before breakfast. Others shot hoops under the watch of indifferent MPs. Some learned how to jump rope. At first it was distraction, then it became ritual. One prisoner, formerly a chef's assistant in Hamburg, began charting his progress with the bench press on scrap paper. Another POW, a quiet corporal who had once boxed in Frankfurt, offered to teach others how to pivot, jab, and slip under a punch. They sparred under fluorescent lights while Americans watched silently from the corners. There was no derision, no mocking, no cheering either. Just eyes watching as men who once swore allegiance to Hitler now shadowboxed under the stars and stripes. For Vogel it became more than a pastime. It became disorienting. Because every day in the gym pulled him deeper into the truth. He was not in a death camp. He was not in a cage. He was in a place where America had built something for the body, even for its enemies. And more disturbing than comfort was the implication. If America could afford to give prisoners punching bags, dumbbells, and hardwood courts, what else could it afford? By late September, the gym became a rumor beyond the fence line. New POWs arriving from New York convoys asked if the stories were true. "You mean a real gym, with real basketball?" "Yes," Vogel said. "But why?" "I don't know," he admitted. But he did know. Not in words, not in reports, but in his bones. Because every thump of the heavy bag, every creak of iron on steel, every bounce of the basketball echoed something the Reich had never prepared him for. A culture that was not starving. A system that didn't need to punish to assert power. A war machine that could build things simply because it wanted to. By early October, the gymnasium had become the unspoken center of Camp McCoy. It was not mandatory. It wasn't even encouraged with much enthusiasm by the guards. But the POWs returned to it like clockwork, not because they had to, but because it gave them a reason to wake up in the morning. Vogel noticed it first in how the days began to stretch into patterns. Wake at 600. Breakfast, real bread, powdered eggs, hot coffee. Then assignments, digging ditches, repairing fences, hauling lumber. But it was always the hours after 1300 that changed them. That was gym rotation, and it was never the same twice. Sometimes the Americans brought in music. A scratchy radio turned low, Glenn Miller or Bing Crosby humming from a corner near the basketball court. Sometimes one of the guards would lace up boots and shoot hoops himself, not even watching the Germans as he dribbled and practiced bank shots with complete indifference. There was no schedule, no formation, just sweat, repetition, and silence. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was internal. The first time Vogel noticed it was the way Fisher stopped speaking about home. At first, the younger man had rambled constantly, stories about Hamburg, about his sister's wedding, about the factory where his father had worked. But over the past 2 weeks, that chatter dried up. Not from despair, but from focus. Every morning, Fisher made a beeline for the squat rack. He loaded 45-pound plates on each side, eyes narrowed, back straight. Then he dropped low and rose again, over and over, grunting softly as his legs trembled. "You're going to hurt yourself," Vogel muttered. Fisher didn't look up. "Not before I get to 250. That number meant nothing to Vogel, but the tone in Fisher's voice did. It was the sound of a man chasing control in a world that had stolen everything from him. One afternoon, a new detail arrived, fresh POWs from the Eastern Front. Men who had been captured in Italy and transported under the assumption they'd be breaking rocks or digging graves in the desert. When they entered the gym for the first time, they froze at the doorway like men staring at an optical illusion. "It's a trick," one muttered. "No," another said, pointing. "That's real iron, real hardwood." They watched as Americans sparred in a corner ring. Two Marines with gloves and mouthguards danced around each other, throwing jabs and weaving low. It wasn't street brawling. It was clean, practiced, athletic. One German, a wiry sergeant named Beck, couldn't take his eyes off the footwork. They move like boxers. They are boxers, said a voice behind them. They turned to see an American lieutenant leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching the sparring match. College boys, he added. Navy team, we rotate them through before they ship out. The Germans blinked. Boxers, officers, given free time and gloves to keep sharp while their country burned. It made no sense. That night Vogel sat on the bunk beside Fisher, rubbing chalk dust from his hands. "Did you notice their uniforms?" Fisher asked. "The Americans." They were clean, white, no patches. One of them had a name stitched into the breast. Vogel nodded slowly. "Personalized gear. It's like they built the war around comfort." Vogel didn't respond, because deep down he was realizing something worse. They didn't build the war around comfort. They had so much excess that they could layer comfort on top of war. One evening, as fall swept over Wisconsin, and the trees behind the camp began to flare with amber and rust, Vogel stayed late after a shift. The gym was nearly empty. He sat on a bench beside the speed bags, watching them swing. Across the room, Sergeant Mallory, the American who oversaw most of the gym rotations, was hanging a new sign above the basketball court. White-painted wood, blocky red letters, it read, "Sweat saves blood." Vogel stood. "What does it mean?" Mallory didn't look down. "Means what it says." He let the words hang, then added, "Train here so you don't bleed out there." He walked off without further explanation. But Vogel stood beneath the sign a long time. Sweat saves blood. Germany had never taught him that. In Germany, you bled first. Training was screaming, marching, freezing, being punished until the weak broke. But here, training looked like something else. Not pain, preparation. A week later, Vogel witnessed something he would remember for the rest of his life. 3 German POWs, all former Wehrmacht infantry, were shooting baskets with 2 U.S. guards in their off-duty hours. No scoreboard, no teams, just 5 men passing, laughing, and playing. Fisher stood beside him, stunned. "They're letting us play with them." "Not letting," Vogel said, "inviting." Fisher frowned. "It doesn't make sense." "No," Vogel said, "it doesn't." And that was the beginning of the fracture. Because up until that moment, every German prisoner had survived captivity by believing in 2 truths: that the Americans were their enemy, and that the Americans hated them. But enemies didn't loan you gloves. Enemies didn't fix the squeaky treadmill. Enemies didn't pass you the ball and laugh when you missed. At Sunday muster, the camp's senior German officer, a rigid SS man named Hauptmann Schroeder, delivered a furious speech against cultural contamination. "This gymnasium is not for leisure," he barked. "It is a test. They wish to soften your mind. Remain vigilant." But no one looked at him. Because Schroeder had never touched a barbell. He had never spent 2 hours trying to land a clean hook in the corner ring. He had never heard an American say "nice form," "kraut," with a crooked grin and no hatred in his voice. For the men who had trained under steel helmets and bayonet drills, the gym was not a threat. It was freedom. By November, it was normal. Prisoners signed up for rotation slots voluntarily. They kept charts. They competed for bench press records. Some began teaching each other English, not from books, but from overheard gym slang. "Spot me." "Go again." "Breathe from the belly." Fisher could do 10 pull-ups without shaking. Vogel had a solid jab-cross combo. One POW, an officer's son from Bremen, began crafting a jump rope from leftover packaging string. Another fixed a broken punching bag strap with wire stripped from a busted bunk spring. They weren't ordered to. They just wanted the gym to work. Because in a world where the war had taken everything, their careers, their country, their future, the gym gave something back. Control, progress, a second chance. And yet beneath it all, a quiet discomfort grew. Because every dumbbell, every hardwood board, every stitched leather glove was proof. Proof that America could give its prisoners a better life than Germany gave its soldiers. That was the part that broke them, not the basketball. Not the punching bags. Not even the kindness. It was the ease, the effortlessness. Vogel didn't say it out loud. But every time he stood in the gym's clean light, every time he saw Marines practicing drills on one side and German prisoners bench pressing on the other, he understood. Germany was not just losing the war. It had already lost the future. By the first frost of December, the gymnasium had become a second reality inside Camp McCoy. Not a facility, not a privilege, a place that lived outside the war entirely. The moment a prisoner stepped through those double doors, the world narrowed down to nothing but chalk dust, thudding bags, rubber soles on varnished maple, and the endless repetition of pushing something heavy and seeing it move. But outside those doors the old world waited. Orders, inspections, guards, and for some fear, not of the Americans but of what it meant to feel safe in their hands. When Vogel crossed paths with Hauptmann Schroeder again, the confrontation didn't come with shouts. Just silence, drawn tight like a wire. Schroeder looked down at Vogel's hands, still chalked from a clean set of deadlifts, and sneered. "You're sweating for them now," he said. Vogel didn't answer. Schroeder stepped closer. "They let you play in their gym, wear their gloves, and you think it means something. It doesn't." Still, Vogel said nothing. But something inside him twisted, not from shame, but from realization. Schroeder was scared. Not of escape, not of interrogation, but of the idea that the Germans here might stop wanting to go home. A few days later, something unexpected happened. An American captain arrived during gym hours, not just to observe, but to speak. A translator stood nearby. His name was Captain Tomlinson, an officer in charge of prisoner cultural integration, a title no German had ever heard before. He didn't lecture. He didn't threaten. He simply walked to the center of the gym while prisoners boxed and lifted and ran laps and said, "This gym exists because we don't fear your strength. We welcome it. Strong men are less dangerous than broken ones." There was murmuring. The translator repeated it. Some laughed, others scoffed. But a few listened, and those few spread the words to others. Because it was a strange message, un-German. In the Reich, you were made strong to dominate. In America, it seemed strength had another use, to stay human. The gym was now a mirror, and it reflected different things for each man. Fisher saw redemption. He wrote numbers in a small ledger he kept tucked in his boot, his squat weight, his reps, his personal best. It became his new war, one he could win. Vogel saw balance. He still bore the mental weight of Tunisia, the chaos of surrender, the shame of letting himself be captured while others died. But in the gym, he moved heavy things and remembered that he was still here, still breathing, still standing. Others found it disorienting. One prisoner, Klaus Reinhardt, a former Luftwaffe mechanic, had broken down after a sparring match, not from injury but from the kindness of his opponent. "He helped me up," Reinhardt said later, shaking, eyes wide. "He knocked me down and then he offered me his hand, smiled like we were equals." Someone joked it was a ploy, but no one laughed. As winter deepened and snow began to pile against the fence lines, something else began to crack: the stories. Stories from Germany. Every week Red Cross letters were delivered. Censored, yes, heavily redacted, but even those scraps painted a grim picture: cities destroyed, rations cut, families scattered. And worse, whispers from new POWs arriving from France. Hamburg firebombed, Cologne flattened, Dresden in flames. Vogel didn't believe it at first. Then a man arrived from a labor camp near Essen. He'd seen the aftermath with his own eyes. "Your house is gone," he told Fisher flatly one night. "The whole block." Fisher didn't speak for 2 days after that. When he returned to the gym, he trained harder than ever, like he could lift the world back into shape. By late January, the gym received an unexpected delivery. A fresh set of boxing gloves, brand new, still in army packaging. Vogel opened the box slowly, peeling back paper like it was sacred. And on the inside flap, stamped in black ink, "Property of U.S. Army, for POW program use." The gloves were made for them. Not hand-me-downs, not surplus. Manufactured, shipped, labeled, delivered. For Germans. For enemies. For men defeated in war. Even Schroeder couldn't ignore it anymore. He made one last attempt to restore the old walls. He convened a closed meeting in Barrack 11. The men chosen were all officers, all loyal. He spoke of discipline, of pride, of the illusion of kindness. "These facilities," he said, gesturing toward the direction of the gym, "are not gifts. They are weapons of comfort, weapons to make you forget who you are." Someone no one would later admit who muttered under their breath, "And who are we now?" No one answered. But everyone heard it. Vogel heard the most startling rumor of all in February. That back in Europe, American soldiers were liberating camps. He didn't believe it, not at first, but the whisper kept returning, from MPs, from mailroom staff, from a Red Cross worker who said very carefully that something had been discovered in Poland, camps not for prisoners of war but for civilians, Jews, women, children. It hit like cold iron to the ribs. Because all this time the war had lived in their heads as uniforms and rifles and front lines, but now something else, something darker. And still every morning the gym doors opened. And still the lights came on. The floor was swept. The gloves were hung. The chalk buckets were full. And the Americans said nothing about revenge. One day, Vogel found himself alone with Sergeant Mallory again, wiping down a bench press station. "I don't understand it," he finally said. Mallory looked up. "What?" "All of this, you treat us like men." Mallory shrugged. "We are men, that's the problem. Wars don't make us animals, they just give us excuses to act like it." Vogel stared at him. In Germany, no one would have said that, not in a uniform, not out loud. And certainly not to a prisoner. Outside, the snow began to melt, and with it the war. Soon the world would end, not in fire but in a signature. The Reich would fall. The uniforms would change. The flags would lower. But inside Camp McCoy, the gym would remain. A place where once enemies lifted iron beside their captors. Where men from opposing armies sweated on the same floor. Where the weight was never political, only physical. The Garins were gone, the rifles silent. But the plates still clanked. The bags still swung. The court still echoed. And in that space, for reasons none of them could explain, they all felt human again. By March 1945, everything was changing except the gym. Germany was dying one city at a time. The Reich was burning from the inside out. News trickled in through coded letters, cracked rumors, and the rare, broken voice of a Red Cross delegate who didn't realize how much truth he was letting slip. Dresden was gone. The Russians were in East Prussia. American tanks had crossed the Rhine. And still, the gym doors opened every morning. Vogel kept showing up. So did Fisher. And more than ever, the place felt like a place outside time, a place where the war couldn't reach. They were still prisoners. Nothing about that had changed. but it was as if the iron they lifted gave them control over at least one thing in a world that had spun beyond all reason. And then came the bulletin. Typed, stamped, and posted outside the mess hall on a rainy Tuesday. Berlin surrounded, Hitler presumed dead, Reich government collapsed. No guards spoke of it, no one celebrated, but the silence in the camp thickened, heavy and unreal. That night Vogel couldn't sleep. At lights out he lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, Fischer snoring softly in the bunk below. He didn't think about the Reich. He didn't think about surrender. He thought about a rack of dumbbells, the satisfying click of plates sliding onto a bar, the whistle of a basketball spinning off the rim. And for the first time, he feared going home. By April, things began to change within the gym itself, not in structure, but in the way the men used it. Before it had been novelty, then ritual, then refuge. Now it was something deeper. Men who once muttered bitterly under their breath now spotted each other in silence. One would grip the bar, the other would nod, "I'm here if you fall." It was a pact, unspoken, but more binding than anything they'd signed in uniform. And Vogel began to notice something that disturbed him far more than Schroeder's lectures ever had. He trusted these men more now than he ever trusted his officers. One afternoon, as spring crept across the pines outside Camp McCoy, and the snow gave way to muddy fields, a new event shook the barracks. An announcement. All POWs would be debriefed. Those who qualified would be offered parole work programs until formal repatriation. It hit the gym like a tremor. What did that mean? Would they be shipped to other camps? Would they be split up? Vogel sat on a bench after training, soaked in sweat, staring at the wall. Fischer sat beside him, arms crossed, legs bouncing. "I don't want to leave," Fischer muttered. Vogel said nothing. But he didn't either. The interviews began the following week. They were conducted by Army intelligence officers in small rooms beside the camp's administrative building. Each man was asked the same things. What was your rank? What unit? Do you still believe in the National Socialist government? What is your opinion of America? Would you be willing to work in agricultural or industrial roles under parole supervision? Some lied, some didn't. When it was Vogel's turn, he stared at the man across the table for a long moment before speaking. "I used to think your kindness was a trick," he said. "Now I think it's a weapon." The officer blinked. "A weapon?" Vogel nodded. "You beat us without firing. You broke something inside us in that gym." The officer said nothing, just wrote something down. Vogel was assigned to the Wisconsin dairy rotation. Fischer to a lumber mill in Iowa. The day the two friends parted, neither hugged, neither saluted. They just stood in the open lot beside the truck, surrounded by dozens of others with duffel bags and slouched shoulders. "You'll keep lifting?" Fischer asked. "Every day," Vogel said. "You." "I want to see what 300 pounds feels like." Fischer smiled. And then he climbed aboard. That spring, as the world tried to understand what had just happened to civilization, the gym remained. New prisoners came, Italians, some Hungarians, a few Austrians. They took the empty slots left behind by Vogel and his generation. But the rules stayed the same. No shouting. No fighting. You break it, you fix it. And if you step into the ring, you touch gloves first. Mallory still oversaw it. He aged quickly that year. His left knee gave out and he walked with a brace now. But he still checked the heavy bags, still called fouls on the basketball court, still stood under the same wall sign that hadn't moved since fall. Sweat saves blood. For Vogel, the dairy farm outside Wausau was quiet, orderly and strange. He spent hours shoveling feed, turning compost, milking rows of cattle under the buzz of sodium lights. but every evening he carved out an hour in the barn. Just him, 2 buckets filled with gravel, and a bar he made from rusted plumbing pipe. He never stopped training. And when his American supervisor found out, he didn't punish him. He brought him a used barbell instead. Years later, when Vogel was finally sent home, he was thinner, older, quieter. His uniform was gone, his papers stamped. Germany was a different place, ashes and silence, the city scarred, the old pride gone. But in Bremen, years after the surrender, Vogel was the first man in his neighborhood to open a gym. It wasn't large. 1 squat rack, 2 punching bags, a small hand-painted court out back, where kids threw balls into a wooden hoop nailed to a pole. He hung a sign over the entrance. Simple lettering, no decoration. Sweat saves blood. The war had ended, but its aftershocks lived on in silence, in customs, in posture. The way a man sat at a table, the way he looked away when asked about what he did in 42. For the German POWs who had spent their captivity in America's inland camps, the return home was jarring. Cities were flattened. Trains didn't run. Old ranks meant nothing. And in a bitter twist of fate, there was less bread waiting for them in Berlin than there had been in barracks mess halls in the Midwest. Some refused to go back. Not from treason, from exhaustion. They had tasted something else. Structure without brutality, discipline without humiliation, a gym without screaming. Fisher never went home. He stayed in Iowa. After his parole expired, he married the daughter of a mill foreman and started a feed business outside Des Moines. He never spoke German again. Vogel did return, not because he believed in what was left of Germany, but because something in him couldn't leave it behind unfinished. He needed to rebuild something, anything. He opened the gym in a gutted factory lot in Bremen. It had no roof at first, just rusted beams and broken glass, but the kids came anyway. Boys with hollow eyes, barefoot in winter, watching him pound iron into plates and weld bars from plumbing scraps. He never charged them, never asked their names. Only one rule. If you enter the ring, you touch gloves. By 1948, others followed. Gyms opened in Stuttgart, Frankfurt, Dusseldorf, sometimes in bombed-out warehouses, sometimes in old bunkers. But the architecture didn't matter. What mattered was what they did inside. They lifted. They boxed. They ran. And they sweated for something other than survival. There was no doctrine behind it, no political plan. But across the ruins of post-war Germany, a new kind of man emerged. Quiet, disciplined, strong but not for glory. And when asked where they learned to train that way, without yelling, without cruelty, without rank, many answered the same. An American camp during the war. The U.S. Army never documented what the gymnasium at Camp McCoy became. There was no memo, no doctrine written on how a basketball court and a punching bag could unravel ideology better than any interrogation. But the guards noticed it. They noticed that the German POWs who used the gym were calmer, less aggressive, more willing to follow orders. And perhaps most importantly, they talked less about Hitler and more about kilograms, reps technique. In 1951, a military historian visiting McCoy for a separate report found the gym still standing. It was used by new recruits now, Korean War draftees. But some of the old equipment was still there. The same punching bags. The same floor. The same sign. Sweat saves blood. He asked a senior MP what the gym had been during the war. The man looked up thoughtful. That, he said, that was the place where the enemy stopped being the enemy. By the time Vogel was in his 60s, he was known around Bremen as the man who taught the orphans how to fight. Some of the boys he trained had no fathers, some had no names, but they all knew how to wrap their hands. He never told them about the war, never wore a medal, never spoke of Tunisia or the surrender or the wooden box marked U.S. Army property. But every now and then, when the doors were closed and the bags were still, he would stand by the entrance and look up at the wall. The old sign was gone. In its place was a scrap of wood with a phrase he had carved in his own hand. "You do not need war to become strong.